Hi, my name is Dr. Mooney. I'm an associate professor of Old Testament theology here at California Baptist University at the main campus. Welcome to Overview of the Bible. I'm a little bit new to this, and so I'm probably going to be really awkward trying to lecture to my computer. But I'm trusting that you're on the other side of this and that you're listening to this, and so I'm going to try to be not so stilted or awkward and be just as personal as I can possibly be. I'm very happy that you're here and hope that this is really beneficial for you. At the onset here of the class, what I want to do first is I want to go over just a grand narrative of the Bible. Most of the time, people treat the Bible as if it's like the bookshelf behind me. It's just several books. Maybe the book here has something to do with the book there. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has something to do with the book that follows it. Maybe it doesn't. That's the idea that people use when people use a Bible. Or even more so, they even get into the book and even extract like pieces of text and things like that. Just a paragraph, maybe they understand, but they don't really understand the rest of it. And so they pull that out as if it has nothing to do with the rest, and they just kind of lean on this little section they seem to understand. It's a really bad way to read anything, and particularly the Bible. So what we want to do first, you'll just see the grand narrative of the Bible. And so we're going to go through, first of all, the this narrative. Excuse me. So the story of the Bible. What is it? Well, the Old Testament it begins in Genesis 1 and 2, where we have creation. And in creation, God is the creator of all things, including people. God is portrayed as sovereign creator over all things material, that is stuff, temporal, time, and functional. He seems to be in charge of things as they happen. Genesis talks about God making people to be his image bearers. So they are created either in the image of God or as the image of God, but either way, they're there to image forth something about God's wisdom and goodness. And this entails that humans would be fruitful and multiply, make more image bearers, care for the rest of God's creation, have dominion over the earth and subdue it, obey God's word, don't eat of the fruit of the tree or of the knowledge of good, or the fruit of the tree, the knowledge of good and evil. And in other words, they're to rule over God's creation by obeying his word, caring for earth, procreating, and enjoying God. There's something about God's creation of mankind that we'll talk about when we get to Genesis that's really unique in the ancient Near East. There seems to be almost tender about it, whereas all the other gods in the ancient Near East created human beings only for slavery. There seems to be some very real, genuine sense of interaction. Though God doesn't seem to need it, he still wants to empty himself seemingly in relationship with regard to human beings. Well, the purpose that God has for mankind creating them then is to dwell with Him and glorify Him. The Westminster Catechism. You should Google that at some point. The Westminster Catechism. The very first question is, "What is the chief end of man?" In other words, what are you made for? It's a really profound question. And the Westminster Assembly said, "You are made that God created you that you might glorify God and enjoy Him forever." That's a remarkable thing to say. One writer, a recent writer back in the 20th century, wrote that he would change "and" to "by." Glorify God by enjoying Him forever. And that is a provocative idea. As we go through the rest of the Bible, we'll see that this kind of enjoyment and this kind of inherent rejoicing and joy and subsequent sort of relinquishing of things that would keep you from that joy is kind of part of the biblical narrative. As we keep on going, though, it seems inherent within human beings, though, not to enjoy God. And so Adam and Eve decide to listen to the voice of a serpent. It's a really strange story where the serpent crawls up and chats with Eve, and she doesn't freak out in any way. She interacts back with the serpent and listens to the serpent and ends up questioning the voice of God. Satan says, "Did God really say?" And that's the very first sort of hint or vision or portrayal of sin. Just simply the questioning of God's goodness and His wisdom. A question God's love and provision for Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve both shift the blame of their sin onto someone else after them both collapsing to these questions. The results of the fall are that the ground, the entire of creation, is cursed along with Adam. Adam now has to work very diligently to get his food, whereas apparently in the garden, the work was certainly there, but not something that Adam would have seen as something that's bad or necessary evil, like you and I tend to unfortunately see work as at times. The relationship between people suffer, as seen in the struggle between Adam and Eve. Eve was told that she would have pain in childbirth now, that she would long for a husband, her husband would rule over her. And also death enters the world. Death now becomes sort of the final word for human beings. When people become afraid of death, they begin living life as if death is the ultimate and final arbiter of their joy. And this is all kind of parameters of the fall. In any other story of the ancient Near East, what you would have after this is the gods just simply trying to slaughter all human beings so they don't have to mess with them anymore. And yet, from Genesis 3 all the way to Revelation 20, the theme, the fabric, if you will, even though it's bound with hopelessness at so many turns, the fabric, if you will, is woven with hope and redemption. And so you've got creation, and you've got fall, and then you got the rest of the Bible that really is bent on redemption. The rest of the Bible tells the story of how God saves mankind from their sin. How he starts in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. God's going to destroy the evil, the serpent. The woman's going to have a child, the seed of the woman. The serpent will strike at the child's heel, but the child will stomp the head of the serpent. I don't know if you ever saw Passion of the Christ, but the opening scene of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is really provocative. It's very, very quiet and very, very sort of intense music, very quietly behind Jesus as he weeps and bleeds just out of stress in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the figure that's supposed to be Satan in the movie, which is brilliantly played, is also in the garden, and out of the bottom of Satan's robe comes this snake, representative of Genesis chapter 3. And as the snake gets close to Jesus, the music begins to swell and swell. And instead of what you would anticipate happening, the snake striking at Jesus, all of a sudden, so fast that it almost looks like that they skipped a frame to make it look like flash, lightning speed. All of a sudden, Jesus stomps the head of the snake. The snake's body stiffens and convulses and drops. And there's this bass drum that when Jesus stomps the snake is boom. And this kind of idea is planted right back here in Genesis 3. One day, the seed of the woman will stomp the head of the snake and will be done with sin. And death won't be the last word. But for right now, there's this hopeless kind of scenario with hope woven through it. That's the entirety of the Old Testament into the New. The rest of the Old Testament is primarily taken up with looking for this seed, looking for this new Adam, and looking for it through the history of the nation of Israel. The New Testament tells us that the seed is in fact Jesus, though, as I mentioned a while ago. In the Old Testament story, God calls Abraham from the midst of a pagan nation to be the head of the nation he chose, Israel. God promises Abraham several things. He promises his name will be great. He promises to have loads and loads of kids. He promises that kings will come from his line. His progeny will possess a particular strip of land that borders the Mediterranean that God's going to give them. And this is all done under the auspices in Genesis chapter 3 of being a blessing to the nations, that Israel and Abraham's seed would in fact be a great blessing to all the families of the earth one day. Abraham has one son, he's got two grandsons, and then has 12 great-grandsons. You've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 12 tribes. And these great-grandsons also produce descendants, but they do so in the nation of Egypt. We'll look at this when we look at the Torah, but real briefly, the way that God, after he brings Abraham out of the Mesopotamian region, and he makes a covenant, a promise to Abraham. And that promise to Abraham was what we just mentioned a while ago. The covenant with Abraham also included, or the promise to Abraham rather, also included that Abraham's people would go into slavery for 400 years. That's not part of the promise. Part of the promise was oppression and slavery, then redemption. It sort of mirrors the creation story to some, and the creation hope and promise to some degree. And so this is exactly what happens. You've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, and the 12 tribes, 12 sons have kids, loads and loads and loads of kids in Egypt as slaves. The slavery occurs when a pharaoh is nervous about the size of the people of Israel, and so he begins to enslave them. And with these guys enslaved, God sends Moses to deliver his people from bondage. You'll read about all this. He does so by sending multiple plagues, chapter 7 through 14 of Exodus, that turns out to be kind of like a divine war. God executing judgment on the gods of Egypt, who were thought to be the greatest and most superior gods in the world at the time, given the fact that Egypt was sort of the superpower of 2 BC in the Middle East. And so he does so, in particularly by sending the final plague that kills every firstborn son in Egypt, and protecting the Israelites that have a lamb's blood over their door, and helping the Israelites to cross the Red Sea. The rest of the Old Testament is the story also of the rise and fall of Israel. Exodus through Deuteronomy has Israel's exodus, the wilderness wanderings, the preparation to enter the promised land. Joshua and Judges have Israel entering the land and conquering the land, trying to occupy the land, but collapsing over and over to idolatry and sin. First Samuel all the way through Second Chronicles comprises 2 histories of the monarchy in Israel. One that sort of answers the question, why are we in exile? Samuel and Kings. One that kind of answers the question, are we able to ever have a future? Are the promises that we see given to David, do they actually still count for us? Israel has this King David, but he also, collapses into sin. And so now, not only are they looking for a new Adam, but they're looking for a new David to some very real degree. The wisdom book and the prophets talk how to live rightly before God. They offer the promise of the Messiah, and we continue to move on into the New Testament. And in the New Testament, the gospel simply confess what we've seen all throughout the Old Testament, that Israel could not obey God, did not obey God, buried themselves in slavery. Adam, same thing, didn't obey God. Israel didn't obey God. At the end of the book of Judges, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right with their own eyes. So the writers seem to think, if we just have a king, we'll be great. But they got a king, and David turned out not to obey God either. And so you get to the New Testament with a failed Adam, a failed Israel, a failed David. And you open up the book of Matthew, and you read of Jesus Christ. And Jesus is, in fact, the son of Abraham, son of David. Here we have Israel. Here we have a new David. They needed a Messiah to give them a new heart, to save them from their idolatry. They didn't have that. This is Israel. And Jesus comes to restore Israel from exile, to provide his people new hearts, to defeat evil, to establish God's reign on earth. And involved with that, he does that through his life, death, and resurrection. And when he does, if you'll remember, we said a while ago that the real threat was death at the end of Genesis. But here you have the turning of death and decay back again. In the book of Acts, Jesus' church is fruitful and multiplies. And the epistles, Romans to Colossians, the writers tell the church how to live in the power of Christ's death and resurrection, particularly under persecution. In 1 Thessalonians all the way through Jude, the church learns how to live rightly in light of Christ's imminent return. And in the last book, the book of Revelation, at the end of the Bible, God restores humanity and his creation, what it was meant to be. It's re-Edenized. It begins with Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and ends when Jesus returns and consummates the kingdom. And so from the very beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, all the way through to Revelation, there's this brilliant narrative. And now that we've gone over that narrative, now we'll go back and we'll begin picking our way through the details. Looking forward to doing that with you. Take care.